Just going back to Moscow Police Department document number 265, regarding the transport of two of the victims. I had covered this document before, but this time I want to include and compare the other document about the two other victims as well. As discussed in the previous video, this document starts out talking about an incident that is unrelated as far as we know. The officer states that someone else saved a video under his name and badge number of someone transporting two police cadets to the Kibbe Dome on November 12. He says he doesn't know who was actually driving the vehicle, but that it was not him. So that is strange, and it's also puzzling why it would be in the same document as the second part, which is about two of the victims being transported from a crime scene. Going on to that part of the document, the officer says that while he was keeping the front door log at the crime scene, a redacted person arrived at the crime scene at 8:51 p.m. This redaction is puzzling because officials or people acting in an official capacity or handling evidence etc. should not have their names redacted. That's the point of freedom of information. But for some reason this name is redacted. It seems most likely this is an official from the funeral home. It says that two of the victims were prepared for transport, and that Captain Lanier wanted this officer to escort the transport to the funeral home. My first thought was that I was surprised the victims would have been left in place for such a long time, all the way until almost 9 o'clock at night, so at least 19 hours after the alleged time of the crime. It had already seemed strange that the coroner was not brought in, as soon as possible, to estimate the time of death. Apparently, she was only allowed in long after many officers and prosecutors had been on scene. For that matter, why had an EMT not been asked in, to witness and document the victim status when the EMTs arrived at the scene that day at noon? They were turned away at the scene. Then the victims being left there for so many hours? I struggle to understand why that would occur. My next thought was, why would they be transported to a funeral home instead of directly to the medical examiner in Spokane to protect the evidence and chain of custody? Then I wondered why only two of the victims were discussed. It turned out the other two were discussed in a completely different part of the documents, nowhere near this document. Anyway, the officer writes that he was the escort to the funeral home during the transport of the first two victims. He states that he stopped recording on his body-worn camera for 7 minutes during the drive. This seems to defeat the purpose of a body-worn camera during this escort. But then he stated he reactivated the camera at 9:37 at the redacted place, mentioned elsewhere as the funeral home. Why would the facility where the victims were taken be redacted? Due to the short time frame of the drive, it appears to be a local funeral home. The officer states he remained in attendance as the two victims were offloaded, and he deactivated his camera at 9:45 p.m. and cleared the scene. Document sequence number 97 discusses the transport of all four victims. It states that redacted person was called to remove the four deceased and transport them to Spokane for autopsy. The beginning of the document would appear to be rather misleading, because the other document indicated the bodies were being taken to a local facility, not to the medical examiner in Spokane directly. At around 9:20 p.m., Officer B writes that he had the other officer follow this redacted person when they transported X and E from the crime scene to their facility. He writes that he had the officer stay at the facility with X and E while the people from the facility, which we know from the other document was a funeral home, returned to the scene to transport K and M. The other officer's report actually stated he cleared the scene after X and E were offloaded. This document described how the redacted official then returned to collect K and M, and Officer B followed the transport back to the funeral home. Once there at redacted facility, he states he watched the redacted official place name tags on the four victims along with corresponding numbers to help identify them. He then placed evidence tape on the body bags to seal them until they could be transported to Spokane for autopsy. He says he photographed the evidence tape and booked the photos into evidence. He states he saw the official place the four deceased into a cooler located in the facility. That is the end of this report. There is no mention of an officer remaining on site or info regarding the later transport to Spokane. Idaho State Police Document 32 also mentions the arrival of the funeral home transport and the later county coroner and her assistant at the crime scene at 8:15 p.m. on November 13 to remove the bodies from the crime scene. We know from the other document, the bodies were transported to a funeral home and placed in a cooler there. There is no documentation of when the transport to the medical examiner in Spokane took place after that, but we know the autopsies were performed on November 16 and 17. In 2025, in a public speaking engagement, The mother of one of the victims described walking to the house the morning of the 14th, and she stated that her son's body was still in the house at that time. Were the parents not informed of the removal of the victims to the funeral home the night before? Many parents would want to witness their loved one, personally identify them, and either accompany them to the funeral home or see them or be present at the funeral home. Even with precautions being taken, of course, to prevent contamination of the evidence, the parents could certainly still view and identify their loved one. While everyone is different, many parents would want to see their child as soon as possible with their own eyes. Clearly most, if not all, of the parents had alibis of their whereabouts at the time of the crime, so there would be no reason not to allow this. You would certainly think they would at least be fully informed along the way. This was so very sad that his mom walked to the house thinking he was still there, and did no one update and inform her otherwise, even at the house? Because she still apparently thought this 3 years later, in 2025. As a parent, my heart really goes out to the parents and siblings.
Anyways, we pulled into Moscow that night at about 9:30, picked our kids up. We had to go to the police station and have a meeting. And we wound up, they put us all up in a hotel that night. And the 4 of us laid in this hotel room. And there wasn't a lot of sleep that happened that night, but early in the morning, I got up. I told Jim, I'm going for a walk, and I walked to the house. My son was still there in it, and I just stood outside of it for a little bit.
Regarding the coroner or other medical personnel not being allowed in for hours at the crime scene while so many officers and prosecutors and other personnel walked throughout the scene, and the bodies being left there for so long, granted, it appeared that some leadership personnel were not in Moscow and it took them hours to get there. So officers were left to secure the scene and handle interviews and everything on their own. But wouldn't the leadership direct them in these matters if they couldn't be there? Another example of this is the siblings of one of the victims being left standing outside in the cold and not being cared for. Instead of sending the EMTs away, the police could have had them assist the siblings and witnesses. The witnesses should all have been separated as well. Additionally, why were the actual autopsy reports by the medical examiner not released? Instead, only very brief summaries of fatal wounds were given by the coroner and police. This is not the same thing. The actual autopsy reports would include data and summaries by the medical examiner regarding many factors from toxicology to stomach contents and so on. As always, everything on this channel is purely my opinion. Everyone is presumed innocent and no accusation is made against any person. Thank you for watching.